"You ungrateful brat," she hissed, slamming the drawer shut with my father's will still inside. "None of it was ever meant for you." I was 25 when I heard that from the woman who raised me after my parents died. Aunt Sarah, who once wiped my tears with hands that smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, looked at me like a stranger now. But what shattered me wasn't the forged signature or that she'd sold my inheritance and bought herself a coastal home behind my back. It was when Linda, her lifelong best friend, the woman who gave me my first scarf, my first comfort when I cried, whispered over the phone, "Nora's asking about the letter. We can't let her dig too deep." I couldn't breathe. The two women who once taught me how to live had decided I didn't deserve to know the truth. The scent of fresh bread used to feel like home. Now it smells like betrayal. But the night I broke into the office and found my father's words beneath layers of dust and lies, everything changed. They thought they'd buried me in the silence, but they forgot. I grew up in the storm. If your heart already aches for Nora, if you've ever trusted someone who twisted that trust, drop a "I feel you, Nora" in the comments. Funny how one forged signature can unravel everything you thought was love. 3 years earlier? The first sound I remember isn't my mother's voice or my father's laugh. It's the deep rhythmic crash of waves against the jagged cliffs of our little coastal town in Maine. I was 5 when the sea became my lullaby. After it took my parents away in an accident, I was too young to fully understand. People said I was lucky to have Aunt Sarah. At the time, I believed them with my whole heart. Sarah was a force of nature, sharp eyes, quick hands, and a laugh that could fill a room. She owned the town's bakery, a warm little haven where the air was always thick with the scent of bread and cinnamon, and where sunlight poured through the front windows like honey. She took me into her creaky wooden house overlooking the shore, told me I was hers now, and promised she'd protect me like I was her own daughter. I can still feel the softness of her sweater as she crouched down to my level in that dimly lit kitchen. She smelled of vanilla and flour. "You're my girl, Nora," she said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Always will be." When I was 8, she taught me how to bake bread. I remember my small hands disappearing into the mound of flour, the way she guided my wrists to fold the dough, the rhythmic push and pull. We'd hum along to the old radio while the waves pounded in the distance, and for those moments, the ache of missing my parents faded into the smell of yeast and the sound of our laughter. Sarah wasn't just my aunt. She was my rock. She faced the world head-on. She could negotiate with gruff fishermen over the price of fresh blueberries in the morning and charm tourists into buying 3 extra pies by afternoon. She was unstoppable, and I wanted to be just like her. But life has a way of whispering things to you, soft at first, like the faint hiss of water under the oven's heat. It was 3 years ago, when I turned 25, that the first whisper came. I was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through an old box of family papers Sarah had set aside for me. She came in just as I was about to pull out a thin envelope at the bottom. Her voice, usually warm, cut through the air like a knife. "Don't bother with that," she said, snatching it from my hands before I could ask what it was. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I told myself it was nothing. She'd always been protective, maybe even overprotective. But that night, lying in my small upstairs bedroom, I kept hearing the waves crash harder than usual, as if they were trying to say something I couldn't quite catch. It was weeks later when I overheard her talking to someone on the phone in the bakery's back room. The words were muffled, but I caught the phrase, "the will," and my father's name. My stomach tightened. My parents had a will? I'd never seen it, never even heard Sarah mention it. From then on, the thought wouldn't leave me alone. I'd watch her work the counter, flour dusting her hair like snow, chatting easily with customers, and I'd wonder, was everything I knew about her real, or had she been keeping something from me all along? There were moments, small ones, that began to feel different. The way her smile sometimes faltered when I mentioned my parents. The way she changed the subject when I asked questions about the past. A glance, quick and sharp, when I lingered too long in the back office. Sarah had raised me, fed me, loved me, or so I thought. But sometimes love can be complicated, knotted up with things you don't see until you start pulling at the threads. I tried to ignore it, to hold on to the version of her I'd always believed in. The woman who'd stand behind me at the mixing bowl, her hands over mine, saying, "Patience, Nora. Good things take time. The woman who bought me my first real winter coat when I was 10, insisting it was practically armor against the cold. The woman who would step between me and anyone who tried to hurt me. But the whisper of doubt had already taken root, and it grew louder each day. Sometimes I'd stand outside the bakery early in the morning, watching her through the window. She'd be arranging pastries in the glass case, moving with the same confident energy as always. But then she'd glance toward the office in the back just for a second, and her expression would change. Softness replaced by something tighter, guarded. It's strange the moment you start to question the person you trust most. It's like realizing the tide has been pulling out from under you the whole time. You just didn't feel it until your feet start to slip. For 20 years, I had believed in her without question. But at 25, with that one overheard word, will, everything shifted. What was in that will? Why had she hidden it from me? Standing in the kitchen that night, the smell of fresh bread filling the air, I looked at her and felt a crack run through the image I'd carried all my life. Sarah was my rock. But what if her promises were just words? Could the woman I called Mom betray me? Mornings at the bakery used to be my favorite part of the day. The air was cool and still, the streets outside barely waking. Inside, the golden light spilled across the glass cases, catching tiny dust motes that floated lazily in the warm air. The scent of yeast and sugar wrapped around me like a blanket. My hands moved without thought, kneading dough until it felt just right, rolling it into smooth, uniform rounds, lining them up like little soldiers waiting for the oven. Behind me, the steady hum of the mixer blended with the low rumble of the ovens, and somewhere beyond the walls came the faint, mournful cries of seagulls circling the shore. It was the kind of morning rhythm that used to comfort me, steady me. But lately something else had seeped into the air. Not the cozy sweetness of pastries or the warmth of cinnamon rolls cooling on the rack. This was sharper, heavier, like the faint bitterness that lingers when you leave a loaf in the oven too long. It was the smell of tension. Sarah had been in the back office since dawn, the door firmly shut. I could hear the uneven scrape of drawers opening and closing, followed by the metallic click of a lock sliding into place. I found myself glancing toward the narrow hallway more than once, my eyes lingering on that closed door. I'd been in that office hundreds of times, dropping off invoices, grabbing extra flour sacks from storage. But lately, it felt like the door had become a line I wasn't supposed to cross. It started about 2 months ago. One evening, after closing, I'd stepped into the office to leave a receipt on her desk. The dim light from the desk lamp spilled over piles of paperwork, and there it was, the middle drawer of her oak cabinet, half open. Before I could think, I caught a glimpse of an old creased envelope tucked inside, my dad's handwriting scrawled across the front. That slanted script, bold at the start, fading at the ends, was burned into my memory. I'd seen it in every letter he'd written to me, every card he'd signed. I froze, my fingers brushing the edge of the desk, but then Sarah turned sharply, quick as a whip. She stepped between me and the drawer, her body a shield. She smiled, but her eyes were tight, unreadable. "Nora, go ahead and finish the frosting. I'll be out in a minute." I remember mumbling an "okay," stepping back, the air suddenly heavier in my chest. I didn't ask about it then, but the image of that envelope has haunted me ever since. This morning, as I stood at the counter piping neat swirls of buttercream onto a fresh batch of cupcakes, the memory gnawed at me until I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Hey, Sarah," I called over my shoulder, keeping my voice casual, like I was talking about the weather. "What's in that letter in your desk? The one with Dad's handwriting?" The sound that followed was sharp, the scrape of her chair against the wooden floor, quick footsteps crossing the office. Her voice hit me before I even saw her. "Don't meddle in things that aren't yours, Nora." I blinked, stunned. In 23 years, Sarah had never spoken to me like that. The piping bag trembled slightly in my hands, a delicate ribbon of frosting sagging across the cupcake. I thought maybe it was something from Mom or Dad. I said, "Leave it." Her voice dropped into something final, almost cold. The silence that followed seemed to press against my ears. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the low drone of the oven fan, even the faint rustle of her sleeve as she crossed her arms. I forced myself to keep decorating, adding a final swirl even though my stomach felt like it had turned to stone. that drawer, that letter. Why was she hiding something from me? What was she afraid I'd find? I told myself it could be nothing. Maybe an old recipe. Maybe a bill she didn't want me to worry about. But my mind kept circling back to that handwriting. Vivid, insistent, impossible to forget. The morning passed in a blur. Customers came and went, the bell over the door chiming as they talked about the fog lifting off the harbor, the fishing boats heading out. I smiled, handed over muffins, poured coffee, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, behind that closed office door. I could picture the desk perfectly, the scattered receipts, the chipped mug holding a mess of pens, the drawer with its polished brass handle and that stubborn, silent lock. The last time I'd seen my father's handwriting was in a birthday card, the year before he died. I still had it tucked in a shoebox upstairs in my room, one of the few tangible pieces of him I had left, proof that he thought of me, that I mattered. Why would Sarah hide something like that? After lunch, Sarah stepped outside to take a delivery into the alley. I stayed behind the counter, wiping crumbs from the glass case with slow, deliberate strokes, my eyes flicking toward the hallway again and again. I thought about slipping in, just for a minute. My pulse quickened. My palms itched with the urge to turn that doorknob. But before I could move, the thud of her boots on the floorboards told me she was back. She passed me without a word, the scent of cold air and fresh coffee clinging to her coat. Her face was unreadable. The rest of the afternoon she was her usual self again, chatting with customers, laughing softly at small-town gossip, humming as she kneaded bread. But the sharpness of that moment in the morning didn't fade. It hung between us like a curtain neither of us dared to touch. When we finally closed up for the night, I lingered, running a damp cloth over the counter long after it was already clean. From the office came the faint shuffle of papers, then that sound again, the small, decisive click of the lock turning. It was such a tiny sound, but it might as well have been a heavy door slamming shut inside my chest. That letter wasn't going anywhere, and if Sarah was hiding it from me, there was only one way to find out why. What's in that letter she's hiding? The bakery was a different creature at night. In the morning, it was all warmth and movement, filled with the sweet perfume of rising dough and the hum of ovens. But now, with the lights dimmed and the front blinds drawn, the air felt thicker, the silence heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Somewhere outside, a lone gull gave a sharp, echoing cry before fading into the steady hush of the ocean. I stood just inside the front door, keys cold in my hand, the metal edges biting into my palm. Sarah had left hours ago, her figure swallowed by the coastal fog, her voice tossed back casually. "Don't forget to lock up." I'd nodded, smiling like everything was fine, when in truth my decision was already made. I wasn't going home until I saw what was in that drawer. The hallway to the back office stretched out like a tunnel, lined with shadows that pooled along the worn wooden floorboards. Each step I took made the boards groan, each sound too loud in the quiet. The smell here was different from the front of the bakery. Less sugar and cinnamon, more the faint tang of old coffee and the musty scent of stacked paper. I paused at the office door, my hand resting on the knob. The room beyond was lit only by a sliver of light from the street lamp outside, cutting across the desk and spilling over the oak drawer I'd been thinking about for weeks. The lock wasn't complicated, old brass dulled by years of fingerprints. I'd slipped a thin butter knife from the kitchen earlier, the handle already slick with nervous sweat. Kneeling beside the desk, I slid the blade into the gap. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I jiggled it gently, listening for that soft, almost apologetic click. It came after what felt like an eternity, quiet but unmistakable. I pulled the drawer open slowly, the runners protesting with a low groan. Inside was the usual clutter, rubber bands tangled together, half-used notepads, a pen with its cap chewed through, but beneath the mess was a crumpled sheet of paper, folded once down the middle. The moment I saw the faint, uneven scrawl at the bottom, my chest tightened. My father's handwriting, slanted, bold at the start and trailing at the end, like he was always in a race with his thoughts. I unfolded it with care, the paper dry and fragile in my hands. Across the top, in faded type, the heading read, "Last Will and Testament." My eyes skimmed over the first few lines, the words swimming in the low light, until they landed on a sentence that knocked the breath out of me. $1 million plot of land in the suburbs. For Nora. That last part, for Nora, wasn't typed. It was in my father's hand, just like the birthday card I kept in a box upstairs in my room. But it looked wounded, as though someone had tried to erase it. The ink was smeared into a gray shadow around the letters, the edges of each word frayed and ghostly. My stomach turned, my fingers tightening around the page as though holding it could anchor me. Who would want to erase that? And why? A bead of sweat slid down my temple as I reached for my phone. The pale blue light spilled across the paper, illuminating the creases and smudges in sharp relief. My hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped it, but I managed to snap one photo, then another, making sure each captured those fading words. The quiet scratch of my fingertip brushing the paper felt deafening in the stillness. I read it again, my pulse hammering in my ears. If this was real, if my parents had truly left me that land, then Sarah had known, and she'd hidden it. That thought hit me with the force of a wave. And if she was capable of burying this, what else had she taken from me? The hum of the front refrigerator suddenly seemed too loud, like it was covering something else. I froze, listening, half expecting to hear her footsteps, but there was nothing. Just my own shallow breathing and the creak of the building settling in the night. Carefully, I folded the paper along its original crease, smoothing it with the flat of my hand. I slid it back under the pile of receipts exactly as I'd found it, my fingers lingering for a moment before letting go. The butter knife went back into my pocket. I eased the drawer shut and twisted the lock until it clicked, sealing it away again. For a long moment I just stood there in the dark office, my phone warm in my palm, the photo glowing faintly on the screen. Those smudged words burned into my mind, their presence both proof and accusation. I thought of Sarah that morning, her voice sharp, her eyes cold. Don't meddle in things that aren't yours, Nora. But this was mine. I stepped back into the hallway, each footfall careful, deliberate. At the front door, I locked it behind me and stepped into the cool night. The air smelled faintly of rain and seaweed, the breeze from the harbor stinging my cheeks. My phone in my pocket felt heavier than it should, like it carried not just an image, but the first piece of a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. As I walked home, my mind spun. Had she sold the land? Was she keeping it for herself? How far would she go to make sure I never learned the rest? The questions came like waves, relentless and cold. Somewhere out in the darkness, the ocean roared against the cliffs, louder than usual, almost angry. If this is real, what else has Sarah kept from me? Is this the truth she's buried? The scent of fresh cookies hung heavy in the air, warm and familiar, yet today it felt wrong. It clung to the back of my throat, sickly sweet, as though it was trying to hide the bitterness underneath. The kitchen was suffocatingly warm, the ovens radiating heat that made the walls feel closer than they were. The low hum of the ventilation fan was constant, blending with the soft, erratic ticking of the cooling racks as they contracted in the heat. Sarah moved around the counters like she had every morning for years, efficient, precise, in control. The trays clinked as she set them down, the spatula scraping softly over the baking sheets before she transferred the cookies onto the wire racks. She didn't look at me, and I couldn't tell if she didn't notice me standing there or if she was simply pretending not to. I had spent nearly the entire night at my kitchen table, hunched over my laptop. The light from the screen had painted my face in a cold glow, while the rest of the apartment remained in shadow. My coffee sat untouched, cold for hours, forgotten beside the mess of papers and my phone. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Public records showing the property sale from last year. My parents' land. The name on the deed. Sarah Carter. The trail of money stopped in a private account that never touched our families. She hadn't just hidden the will fragment from me. She had already taken it, sold it, without a word. I stepped further into the kitchen, each breath tasting of melted chocolate and sugar, until it was almost too thick to swallow. My hands curled at my sides, nails digging into my palms. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sharper than I'd planned. Sarah finally glanced over her shoulder, holding a tray of cookies like a shield. "About what?" Her tone was light, almost playful, but I could hear the stiffness beneath it. "You know what?" I took another step closer, keeping my voice even though my pulse was pounding in my ears. I found part of Dad's will, the one that says the land was for me. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, panic flashing like lightning before disappearing. She set the tray down with deliberate care, then gave a short, brittle laugh. "Oh, Nora, that? Just a draft. Your dad was always scribbling nonsense on papers. It didn't mean anything." Her words landed like a cold slap. "A draft?" I echoed, my voice catching on the word. "That's what you're calling it?" She shrugged and turned back to the counter as though the conversation was over. "You're making something out of nothing." But I had the proof. I'd seen the dates, the buyer's signature, the missing money. "I know you sold the land last year," I said, my tone low and steady now. "I know the money never came to us. Where did it go, Sarah?" Her hands stopped mid-motion. The hum of the oven filled the space between us. She didn't turn. "Tell me I'm wrong," I pressed. "Look me in the eye and tell me I'm wrong." Slowly she turned to face me. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze sharp and unblinking. "You don't understand the way these things work," she said. Her voice was calm, but I could feel the blade beneath it. "How could you lie to me?" My voice broke despite my best effort to keep it steady. "After all these years? After everything?" She didn't flinch, didn't explain, didn't even offer the faintest shadow of regret. She simply picked up the spatula and began sliding cookies from the baking sheet to the cooling rack again. The soft metallic clink seemed louder than it should, like it was punctuating every unspoken word between us. The kitchen seemed to shrink around me. The heat pressed harder, the walls leaning in, the air heavy and stale. I saw every detail, the fine creases at the corners of her eyes, the faint sheen of sweat along her hairline, the deliberate way she avoided my gaze. In my mind, old memories blurred and twisted. Her hand over mine as we kneaded dough. Her voice reading me bedtime stories, her laughter ringing through the house on cold winter mornings. They warped and burned away until all that was left was this moment, the truth pressing down on me with a weight I couldn't bear. The ache in my chest spread, making it hard to draw a full breath. My knees felt unsteady and my hand reached instinctively for the doorframe to keep me grounded. She didn't follow when I stepped back. She didn't say my name. She didn't ask where I was going. From the front of the bakery, the bell above the register chimed, followed by the low murmur of customers and a sudden burst of laughter. It sounded distant, almost mocking in its lightness. I walked out without another word, the heat of the kitchen still clinging to my skin, seeping into me like something that wouldn't wash away. In that moment, it felt like the ground beneath me had split open. My trust, my family, my history, everything I thought was certain, was collapsing under the weight of a lie I had never seen coming. My world feels like it's crumbling. The beach stretched out before me, endless and gray under the dim light of a fading sun. The Atlantic roared like it was trying to swallow the shore whole, each wave hurling itself against the jagged rocks with a force that rattled in my bones. The wind tore through my coat, slicing through to my skin until my fingers felt stiff inside my pockets. I could taste the salt in the air, sharp and bitter on my lips. The cold sand clung to the edges of my boots, damp enough to seep in if I stood still too long. I sank down onto the sand, drawing my knees to my chest, my arms wrapped tightly around them, more for comfort than warmth, though neither seemed to help. The chill was punishing, but in some twisted way I welcomed it. The cold was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything else. It didn't smile at me one moment and stab me in the back the next. Sarah's voice echoed in my mind, that smooth, casual dismissal. "Just a draft, Nora. Your dad scribbled nonsense." It looped over and over, each repetition cutting a little deeper. I saw the way her eyes had shifted for just a moment. Panic, before she masked it with a laugh. That single flash of truth burned hotter in my memory than anything she said after. I let my eyes fall shut, but that only made it worse. The memory shifted without permission. I was 8 again, standing on a stool in the bakery's warm kitchen. My small hands were buried in a mixing bowl while Sarah stood beside me, her sleeves rolled up, a faint smudge of flour on her cheek. "Like this," she'd said, her voice soft, curling her fingers around mine to shape the dough into hearts. I remembered the sweet scent of vanilla filling the air, the hum of the ovens, the way her laughter seemed to wrap around me like a blanket. That image used to make me smile. Now it twisted like a knife in my chest. How much of it had been real? Had she always been wearing that warmth like an apron? Easy to put on when it suited her, just as easy to toss aside when it didn't? The waves slammed harder, spraying icy mist across my face. I didn't bother wiping it away. My thoughts were already a tangle. Bedtime stories, birthday cakes, the way she'd wake me with a plate of fresh muffins on winter mornings. All those moments I'd clung to as proof of love. Were they just props in a play I didn't know I was in? The light was bleeding out of the sky when I finally forced myself to move. I brushed the damp sand from my coat, the grains sticking stubbornly to the fabric. My boots crunched over the pebbles, each step carrying me closer to town. The ocean's roar faded behind me, replaced by the lonely whistle of the wind winding through narrow streets. By the time I reached the edge of Main Street, night had taken hold. The bakery stood ahead, its windows dark except for a faint glimmer from the street lamp overhead. The familiar sign above the door swayed gently in the wind, creaking on its rusted hinges. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadowed mouth of the alley across from the bakery, perfectly still, watching. My chest tightened instantly. At first, I told myself they might just be waiting for someone, a passerby taking shelter from the wind. But then I caught it, the pale glint of an envelope in their hand, catching just enough of the lamplight to stand out. They tilted their heads slightly toward the bakery window. The movement was small but deliberate. I froze where I was, my breath shallow. The street was otherwise empty, the night so quiet I could hear the faint rustle of paper as the envelope shifted in their grip. They didn't knock. They didn't move toward the door. They just stood there, a silent shadow holding something they clearly didn't want seen. A gust of wind swept down the street, making the bakery sign creak louder, the sound stretching into the stillness between us. I took one careful step forward, my eyes locked on the figure. But the moment my boot hit the curb, they moved, stepping back into the darkness of the alley until the envelope disappeared into the folds of their coat. Then, nothing. The space where they had been was empty, as if they'd been swallowed whole by the shadows. I stood rooted in place, my pulse hammering in my ears. My mind flashed with images. Sarah's locked drawer, the crumpled will with the smudged writing, the missing money. And now this stranger, lingering near the bakery at night, carrying something they didn't want to share. The wind rattled the bakery's window panes, snapping me out of my trance. Every instinct in me screamed to run across the street, to throw open the bakery door and tear through every shelf, every corner, until I found whatever truth Sarah was hiding. But my legs wouldn't move. Not tonight. Not when my thoughts were already splintering into too many questions. I turned away, forcing my feet to carry me down the street toward home. The envelope, the shadowed figure, the deliberate way they had vanished, those images replayed in my mind with every step. The ground beneath me felt unsteady again, another fault line forming beneath the fragile trust I'd been holding on to. Was this about Sarah's secrets, or was there something bigger, something I hadn't even begun to see? One thing I knew for certain, I wasn't the only one watching the bakery. Who are they and what do they know? I told myself I couldn't keep looping through the same questions, replaying Sarah's words until they hollowed me out. The figure outside the bakery, the envelope, the lies, they all pressed in, heavy as the overcast sky above. I needed someone who'd known Sarah for years, someone who might see the cracks I couldn't, and when I searched my memory for who that could be, only one name came up: Linda. Linda had always been there. She wasn't family by blood, but she'd wrapped herself into my life like she belonged there. Sarah's best friend since before I was born, she was the one who slipped me extra frosting roses from birthday cakes, the one who made sure my mittens were dry before I went back out into the snow. She had a way of making me feel like I was worth looking after. Her house was just a few blocks from the bakery, set behind a white fence weathered soft at the edges and a hedge that smelled faintly of lavender in summer. But today, the air was sharp enough to sting my cheeks, and the clouds hung low and gray like wet wool. I walked the narrow brick path, hearing the crunch of scattered acorns beneath my boots. A knitted wreath on her door absorbed the sound of my knock, making it feel almost secret. When she opened the door, a wave of warmth met me, heat from the fireplace, cinnamon in the air, and the faint lemon scent of polished wood. "Nora," she said softly, her voice curling around my name like a scarf. "Oh, honey, come in." Inside, it was exactly as I remembered. Beige couches that seemed to sigh under your weight, a coffee table cluttered with magazines and a half-finished jigsaw puzzle, and shelves lined with family photos. My eyes snagged on one from years ago, me at 10 years old, grinning over a plate of cupcakes, Linda's arm looped around my shoulders. That picture hit me like a bittersweet bruise. We sat across from each other. The hum of the kettle in the kitchen was steady, almost like a heartbeat. Linda reached across the table, her palms warm against my cold hands. "I heard there's been trouble," she said, pausing before the last word, as if choosing it carefully. I hesitated, then let it out. "I found part of my dad's will. It says the land was supposed to go to me. Sarah sold it last year, and the money never touched the family account. I don't understand why she'd do that, Linda. I thought maybe you'd know something." Her face softened instantly, like she'd been waiting for me to say this. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, giving my hands a gentle squeeze. "I'm so sorry you're caught in the middle of this. I'll talk to Sarah, see if she'll open up. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding." Her tone was careful, almost too careful, but I swallowed my doubt. This was Linda. She'd never turned me away before. We talked a few minutes more, me thanking her promising to see what she could do. When she stood, she hugged me tight, her breath warm against my ear. "You leave it to me," she said. "I'll take care of it." Outside, the cold bit deeper after the warmth of her living room. My breath rose in pale clouds as I walked toward the sidewalk, but halfway down the path, I realized my scarf was still draped over her couch. I turned back, heading down the side path toward the kitchen door, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. That's when I heard her voice. It slipped through the half-open window, lower now, urgent. "Nora's asking about the letter. What do we do?" The words hit me in the gut. "The letter?" My pulse leapt hard in my throat. A pause, then her voice again, even softer. "No, she doesn't suspect anything. I told her I'd talk to you. Just keep it together. We can't let her dig too deep." I couldn't hear the person on the other end, but I didn't have to. I knew. Her voice was stripped of its earlier warmth, replaced with something clipped and precise. A voice that belonged to someone protecting Sarah, not me. I stepped back, my boot crunching loud in the gravel this time. The sound made her pause mid-sentence. My stomach turned cold. I didn't wait to hear more. I backed away and walked quickly down the alley, my breath coming sharp, the cold air scraping at my lungs. Even Linda was in on it. The thought was like another wave crashing over me, the kind that drags you under before you can catch your breath. It wasn't just Sarah lying to me. This was bigger, woven tight with people I'd trusted, people who'd smiled at me across dinner tables and handed me gifts on my birthday. By the time I reached the end of the street, my fists were buried in my coat pockets, nails pressing into my palms. Every memory of Linda, the cocoa, the scarves, the laughter, now felt staged, like lines from a script she'd been reading all along. The betrayal burned hot, but beneath it something colder settled in, a resolve that didn't shake. If they were working this hard to keep me from the truth, then the truth had to be worth finding. I didn't know what this letter was. I didn't know how far Sarah's reach went. But I knew one thing. I wasn't stopping. What else was Sarah hiding? And how many more were helping her hide it? After Linda, I realized I couldn't keep stumbling forward, hoping the truth would just fall into my lap. Every time I reached for someone I trusted, they slipped through my fingers, or worse, they were already tangled in Sarah's web. If I wanted answers, I'd have to hunt them down myself, and I needed someone who could help me dig without flinching. That's when I thought of Ethan. We'd grown up together, back when the town still felt small enough that everyone knew your birthday, your favorite pie flavor, and the names of your pets. He was the one who didn't snicker when other kids whispered about my family behind my back. Now he was a lawyer, the kind who didn't just know where to look. He knew where people hid things they didn't want found. I called him first thing in the morning, my bare feet cold against the kitchen tile, the coffee maker hissing and sputtering like it was impatient with me. The second he answered, my voice came out in a rush. "Ethan, I think Sarah sold my father's land under my name, and it's bigger than that. People I've trusted are covering for her." There was a pause, just the faint hum of the line before he said, "You'll need more than suspicion. We find the records, we find the truth." Meet me at the town hall in an hour." By the time I reached the old brick building, the wind had picked up, driving dry leaves in tight little swirls across the steps. Each crunch under my boots sounded louder than it should, echoing in the stillness of a too-quiet morning. Inside, the air was cool and carried that faint, musty scent of paper that had been sitting untouched for years. The records room was in the basement. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets, each one dented from decades of use. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting pale, uneven shadows that made the corners seem farther away than they were. I could hear the low hum of the heating system somewhere behind the walls. Ethan was already there, leaning over a large table, his sleeves rolled up. He glanced up when he saw me and gave a quick nod. "Start with property transfers from last year," he said, sliding a thick, bound ledger toward me. The paper was rough beneath my fingertips, each page whispering when I turned it. We searched in silence except for the occasional scrape of a chair or the muted thump of another book hitting the table. My eyes blurred over rows of names, dates, and signatures until Ethan's voice cut through. "Nora, come here." I stepped beside him, the faint citrus scent of his aftershave grounding me for a second before my gaze followed his finger. There it was, my father's land. The date matched. The signature matched. My stomach tightened, but it was the seller's agent line that made my breath stop. David Harper. I blinked at the name, as if that would make it change. "David? My Uncle David?" "The same," Ethan said, his voice low, almost like he didn't want the walls to hear. "Something's off, Nora. This sale smells dirty. If David was the agent, Sarah didn't just wake up one day and decide to do this. It was planned." I stared at the neat black letters, the way the ink seemed too solid, too final. David, Sarah's ex-husband, was supposed to be gone. I hadn't seen him since the day he walked out, suitcase in hand, not looking back. I'd been younger then, old enough to understand it meant he wasn't coming back, too young to ask why. But now, the moment Ethan said his name, a memory stirred. I was 12, standing in the hallway outside Sarah's study. The door was closed, but voices slipped through. Sarah's, tight, clipped, and a man's murmur, deep enough to vibrate in my chest even from where I stood. David's. "Not over the phone," he'd said, the words slow, careful. "We'll discuss it when you're alone." Then a pause, the faint sound of a chair scraping, and Sarah's reply, lower but sharper. "We can't risk anyone finding out." Back then I thought it was some adult argument I wasn't meant to hear. Now it felt like a puzzle piece I'd been holding for years without knowing where it belonged. Ethan closed the ledger, the sound heavy in the still air. His eyes met mine, steady but edged with something I couldn't quite name. "If David's involved, it's not just a shady sale, it's a cover. And believe me, he knows how to cover things. He doesn't leave his name on paper unless he wants someone to find it, which means either he's gotten careless or he's baiting someone." The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, their light turning the dust in the air into slow-moving specks. My pulse thudded in my ears. If David's in on it, how far does this web of lies spread? Ethan didn't answer. His silence was heavier than any words. Finally he said, "You need to tread lightly. People like David, like Sarah, they've been doing this longer than you've been looking. They'll see you coming from a mile away." I nodded, but my mind was already racing ahead. Every step closer to the truth felt like walking into a storm I couldn't see the edges of. And yet, the thought of stopping felt worse, like choosing to stay in a room filling slowly with smoke. David wasn't just a name from my past anymore. He was here, in the middle of everything. And if he and Sarah were working together, then whatever they were hiding wasn't small, and it wasn't harmless. What bigger secret were they hiding? The bar crouched at the edge of town like it had been forgotten, its weathered siding peeling into strips and the neon "open" sign stuttering weakly against the darkness. The parking lot was a patchwork of oil stains and scattered beer cans, crunching under my boots as I crossed. Inside, the air was thick enough to taste. Smoke clung to my coat. The bitter tang of stale beer coated the back of my throat, and the low hum of a jukebox spilled out an old rock ballad no one cared to listen to. Dim overhead lights hung like tired eyes, throwing puddles of yellow over sticky tables. the smell of fried onions mixed with damp wood, and somewhere in the back, a glass clinked against another, followed by a muffled laugh. It was the kind of place where conversations went to hide, and secrets could rot in peace. David was there, exactly as Ethan had said, slouched in a booth tucked into the farthest corner, half swallowed by shadows. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, his hair thinner, his skin marked with lines carved deep by years of hard living. But the smirk? That was unchanged, sharp, almost amused, like he'd been expecting me all along. I slid into the booth across from him, the vinyl seat groaning in protest. Between us, I set a small cardboard box on the table. Inside sat a single cupcake, its swirl of pale pink frosting topped with a silver sprinkle. "Thought you might want a taste of the old days," I said, my voice steadier than my pulse. His gaze flicked to the box, then to my face. "Didn't think you'd come looking for me, kid." His voice was low, rough, like gravel dragged over wet pavement. "I'm here for the truth," I said. "About the land. About Sarah." For a moment, he didn't answer. He leaned back, the cracked leather of the seat squeaking, and drummed his thick fingers on the tabletop, each tap sticky with years of spilled drinks. Then he blew out a long breath. "She needed money, big money. I helped her sell the land. My cut cleared some debts." "Debts?" The word cut from me before I could temper the edge in my tone. He shrugged, unapologetic. "Cards. Got in deep. She knew I could move paperwork without too many questions." His eyes narrowed. "Figured you'd be mad, but you should know, Sarah was never planning to keep you in that house." The air in my lungs turned to ice. "What do you mean?" David's smirk deepened, like he was savoring the moment. "She forged your signature, Nora. Transferred the deed to me first so it'd look clean. Then I sold it to the buyer. Money went straight to her. She bought herself a new place out by the coast. She's getting out, ditching the town, ditching you." The words landed like a blow to the ribs, knocking the air out of me. My hand tightened around the cupcake box, and when I opened it, the small cake sat there so perfectly still, so stupidly innocent, it felt like mockery. I'd baked it that morning, thinking maybe a gesture of warmth would crack open a piece of the man I remembered. Instead, my fingers pressed into the sponge until it collapsed, frosting smearing across the table in a limp, ruined spiral. "She forged my name." My voice was barely a whisper, but each word was heavy, bitter. "And she meant to leave me behind." David didn't flinch. "Don't take it personal. She's always been about survival. You were just—" He stopped, maybe realizing the next word would go too far. "Just what?" I demanded. He glanced away, jaw working. "Doesn't matter now. She's got her exit lined up. You can't stop her." I sat there, staring at him, my ears filling with the muffled thump of the jukebox, the clink of a glass behind the bar, the low cough of a man at the counter. Every memory of Sarah tumbled through me. The nights she tucked me in, the mornings she left muffins on the counter, the way her laughter used to fill our kitchen. Was it all just strategy? Had every scrap of affection been measured out for convenience until the day she decided I wasn't worth the cost? My chest felt like it was splintering, each piece grinding against the next. But beneath the heartbreak, something colder formed. It was small at first, just a sharp point of steel in my gut, but it spread fast, steadying my hands. I shoved the crushed cupcake toward him, the frosting sticking to my fingertips like glue. "You can tell Sarah this," I said, my voice low and even. "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not done." David's laugh was short, humorless. "You think you can fight her? She's already 10 steps ahead." I stood, the chair scraping against the sticky floor, the sound slicing through the bar's lazy murmur. "Then I'll take 11. When I stepped outside, the cold night air slammed into me, sweeping the smoke from my lungs. My breath came in quick bursts, each one sharp in the frigid air. My hands were trembling, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was fury. She had taken my inheritance, my name, and nearly every shred of trust I had left. But she hadn't taken the one thing she'd need to break me, my will. She forged my signature. She planned to erase me. I swear to fight back. The bakery was dark when I returned, the kind of still darkness where every small sound seems amplified. The moon hung low outside, its pale light slipping through the front windows in narrow strips, painting the counter and walls in cold silver. That same light stretched Sarah's shadow across the tiled floor, long and sharp-edged, making her presence feel bigger, heavier. She was leaning against the counter, arms crossed as if she'd been waiting for me for hours. When I stepped inside, the bell over the door gave a soft jingle that felt far too light for the tension in the air. My coat carried the lingering stench of the bar from earlier: smoke, stale beer, and a faint trace of whiskey that clung stubbornly to the fabric. The cold air followed me in, curling around my ankles before fading into the warmer air inside. My heart was pounding, but when I spoke, my voice came out even. David told me everything. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, catching a sliver of moonlight, and a slow, deliberate smile spread across her face. It was the kind of smile that said she already knew what I'd heard. "Oh, did he?" she murmured, pushing herself off the counter. Her heels clicked against the tile as she closed the space between us. "And you believed him? That's cute." "I believe the part where you forged my name," I said, my hands curled into fists at my sides, "and the part where you planned to leave me behind." Her smile thinned into a sneer. "You think you're smarter than me, Nora? You think you can take me down? I've been playing this game a lot longer than you have." The words were meant to dig under my skin, to make me doubt myself, but something in me refused to bend this time. I took a step closer, my voice steady even as I felt my pulse in my throat. "Then maybe you've been playing it too long. You're sloppy now." Her laugh was short and sharp, echoing off the walls. "Sloppy? You've got nothing." Then my eyes landed on the counter. Her phone sat face down, but the faint glow from the screen betrayed a recent message. I didn't think, just moved. My hand closed around it before she could react. She lunged forward, but I stepped back, holding it high. "Don't," I warned. Her voice dropped to something darker, more dangerous. "Give me my phone, Nora." I ignored her, unlocking it with the code I'd watched her use 100 times. My fingers trembled slightly, but not from fear. Adrenaline was driving them now. The glow of the screen lit my face as I scrolled, and then I saw them. Lines of text to David, to Linda, each one hammering the truth home. "We'll sign the papers next week. Make sure Nora doesn't find out until it's done. I'll be gone by summer." The bakery was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge in the back. Each word on that screen was a knife, carving away the last scraps of trust I'd had left. I looked up, meeting her eyes, and saw something flicker there. Not guilt, not shame, but calculation. She knew I had crossed a point of no return. "You," I said slowly, keeping my voice low. "You can't hide anymore. I'm taking back what's mine." She scoffed, though her jaw had tightened. "You don't have the guts to fight me in court." "Watch me," I said, and I meant it. I walked past her, the phone still in my grip. The faint scent of sugar and vanilla that always clung to the bakery wrapped around me, but tonight it felt sour. Behind me I heard her mutter something under her breath, but I didn't stop. The next morning I called Ethan. My voice was rough from the night before, but my mind was sharp. I told him about the texts, the way Sarah had smiled like she'd already won, the way the words on that screen had sealed her betrayal. "We'll need to move fast," he said immediately. "I'll put you in touch with a litigator I trust, someone who won't let Sarah bully her way out of this." By the afternoon, I was in a lawyer's office, the hum of a heater in the background, and the faint smell of fresh coffee drifting in from the hallway. The attorney, a woman with precise movements and eyes that missed nothing, listened without interrupting as I laid out every detail, from David's confession to the texts on Sarah's phone. When I handed her the printed copies Ethan had helped me pull, she scanned them slowly, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded once. "You have enough to file a case. It won't be easy. People like your sister, people who've been lying for years, don't go down without a fight, but this is a solid start." Her voice was calm, but the weight of her words grounded me, like steel running down my spine. I thought about the way Sarah had stood in that moonlight last night, so certain I couldn't touch her. I thought about every year I'd spent defending her, trusting her, believing in her. And then I thought about how it felt to finally look her in the eye and refuse to back down. That night, back in my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of legal papers in front of me. Outside, the moon was full again, its light spilling across the table in a cold, unwavering beam. My pen moved slowly, but with purpose, each signature scratching across the page like a promise. She thought I'd roll over. She thought she could erase me with a forged signature and a packed suitcase. She was wrong. I'm ready to take her to court. The courthouse rose from the center of town like an old sentinel, its pale stone walls etched with decades of wind and rain, its tall, arched windows catching the pale winter light. The heavy oak doors looked as if they'd been built to keep secrets in or lock justice out. As Ethan pulled up to the curb, the morning air bit at my cheeks, each breath sharp enough to sting. I stepped out, clutching my coat tighter, feeling the weight of every step toward those doors. Inside, the smell hit me first. A mix of polished wood, faint paper dust, and the almost medicinal tang of cleaning solution. The high ceiling stretched above dark, heavy beams, and rows of wooden benches lined the floor, worn smooth by years of anxious hands and restless feet. The judge's dais sat elevated at the far end, flanked by the flag and the state seal, and the air inside seemed to carry its own hush, a silence too thick to break without purpose. Ethan was already at our table, leaning close to our lawyer. She was calm, deliberate, arranging the files into a precise order: the will, the property sale records, the printed screenshots of Sarah's texts. Each sheet was crisp, unassuming, but together they held months of sleepless nights, the threads of my parents' legacy, and the proof that Sarah's betrayal wasn't just in my head. When Sarah entered, the air shifted. She moved like she owned the floor, chin high, shoulders squared, but there was something too rigid in her stride. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, each step a metronome in the tense stillness. She avoided looking at me until she reached her table. When our eyes finally met, hers burned, not with shame, but with something colder, more dangerous. Defiance with a thin edge of desperation. The bailiff's voice rang out, calling the court to order, and the judge emerged. His black robe swept as he crossed the room, expression carved in stone. The gavel struck once, a hollow, resonant crack that seemed to sink into the floorboards. Our lawyer rose first. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear," she began, her voice even, unshaken. She slid the will forward, the thick paper whispering against the polished wood. Pointing to my father's genuine signature, she then placed the transfer papers beside it, showing the smudged, clumsy forgery. The plaintiff's name was used without consent to transfer her rightful inheritance, first to the defendant's former spouse, then to an outside buyer. We have direct written communication from the defendant detailing her intent to conceal the sale and relocate before discovery. The judge's gaze shifted toward Sarah. She didn't move a muscle. Her attorney leaned in, whispering something too low for me to hear, but she kept her stare fixed ahead, her jaw clenched so tightly I could see the faint pulse at her temple. Ethan handed over the next piece of evidence, the property sale record naming David Harper as the agent. Our lawyer walked the judge through the timeline: the sale, the quick transfer of funds, the purchase of a coastal property under Sarah's name. Each document felt like a stone stacking inside me, building something solid in the place where doubt had once lived. This wasn't just paper. It was the proof I'd been clawing toward, the thing that turned whispered accusations into undeniable fact. When the screenshots of her texts appeared on the bench, the silence in the room grew heavy. "We'll sign the papers next week. Make sure Nora doesn't find out until it's done. I'll be gone by summer." Seeing them in stark black and white made my stomach twist. For the first time, Sarah's eyes darted to me, a quick, assessing look, like she was trying to gauge if this was the moment I'd break. I didn't. My hands rested flat on the table, my breath steady. Inside, my mind repeated the vow I'd been carrying for months. This is for Mom and Dad. I won't let her win. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled, scanning the evidence again. The gavel sat before him, its polished wood catching a beam of light from the high windows. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was the symbol of the line we were standing on. One strike, and this could tilt toward justice or loss. No one spoke. The heating system's faint hum filled the stillness, broken only by the soft shuffle of papers from the clerk's desk. I realized my heartbeat had synced with that low hum, slow, constant, unrelenting. Finally, Sarah's attorney stood, delivering a short objection about interpretation of intent. His voice was smooth but lacked conviction. He didn't look at me, not once. The judge didn't respond immediately. His gaze moved between us, me, the sister clinging to what was left of her family's honor. Sarah, the sister who'd tried to rewrite it for herself. His hand moved to the gavel, brushing the handle like he was testing its weight. I inhaled slowly, my chest tight. This was the edge of the fight. The moment every piece of work, every late night, every painful confrontation had been leading to. The room felt suspended, like the air itself was holding its breath. The gavel lifted, and in that suspended second, it felt like the whole room leaned toward the bench. Will justice be served? The ruling came on a cold Thursday morning, the kind of cold that bit straight through my coat and made the air sting in my lungs. Inside the courthouse, the smell of varnished wood and old paper hung heavy, and the silence felt almost ceremonial. The gavel struck, its sharp crack echoing off the walls like a breaking branch, and the judge's voice carried the finality I'd been chasing for months. Sarah was ordered to repay every cent she had stolen through forged papers and lies. She didn't look at me, not once. No flicker of guilt, no whispered apology. Her eyes stayed fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom doors, her face carved into something hard and unyielding. When it was over, she left with her attorney, her heels clicking in a fading rhythm down the marble hall. By the time I stepped outside, the only trace of her was a faint thread of perfume dissolving into the cold wind. The money didn't arrive in a neat package. It came in staggered payments, like pieces of something broken being returned one shard at a time. But it was enough to buy back our wooden house. The first time I walked through those doors again, it felt like stepping into a photograph that had been waiting for me. The cedar beams still carried that warm resin scent, and the walls still whispered with the smell of flour and cinnamon from years of baking. My fingers brushed over the grooves in the kitchen doorway where Dad had marked our heights each year, the pencil lines faint but stubborn, just like him. The bakery came next. Before, it had been just a place to keep the lights on, a lifeline I clung to while everything else fell apart. Now it became something I could build on. I had the front repainted in a warm cream, with trim the color of sea glass pulled from the shore. Above the door, a new wooden sign hung proudly, the grain smoothed by hours of sanding. In the bottom corner, carved deep enough to last, were my parents' names. Not as decoration, never that, but as a promise. Anyone who stepped inside would know whose hands had built these roots. Inside, the changes felt alive. The cracked glass display case was replaced with one that gleamed under soft golden lights. Shelves were lined with jars of cinnamon, cocoa, nutmeg, and the kind of vanilla that perfumes a room the moment you open it. Every surface seemed to hum with small sounds, the gentle thud of mugs on tabletops, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of voices mixing with the faint roar of the ocean just down the street. Every night after closing, I baked cupcakes, always 3 extra, always for my parents. I placed them on the corner table by the front window. The frosting swirled the way Mom liked, simple and smooth, and the sponge as light as Dad had taught me to make it. One evening, a customer asked about the tradition. "These cupcakes are for my parents," I told her. She smiled softly, eyes lingering on the table for a moment before turning back to her coffee. She didn't ask anything else. Over time, the bakery stopped being just mine. It became part of the community. Fishermen came in straight from the docks, smelling of salt and wind, their hands wrapped around hot coffee. Students hunched over textbooks, crumbs of lemon tart on their pages. Old friends sat by the window, their laughter spilling out into the street as the sun dipped low. Somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't just selling baked goods. I was building something new, knitting together a family from the people who walked through my door. Still, there were nights when the quiet felt too heavy. When the wind from the Maine coast pressed against the windows hard enough to make them tremble, and the waves outside crashed like distant drums. That's when I'd hear it, the whisper. Not words exactly, but the slow pull of the tide, speaking to the parts of me that were still learning how to heal. The ocean had always been there, constant and unjudging, carrying the weight of every goodbye and every return. Sometimes I stood at the back door, looking out at the dark water. The salt in the air stung my eyes, or maybe it was just the memories pressing too close. That's when I'd think of the shadowy figure I'd seen before, the one lingering near the edge of the docks when everything in my life was coming undone. I never knew who it was, someone watching, or someone just passing through. But the image stayed with me, a thread of unease in the fabric I was trying to mend. I had won. The court had seen the truth. I had my home back, my bakery, and a life that finally felt like it belonged to me. But victory is a strange thing. It doesn't wipe away the hurt. It just gives it somewhere quieter to live, tucked in the corners of your mind, where the light doesn't always reach. Some nights, the scars hummed beneath my skin like an old ache when the weather turned. I'd finish wiping down the counters, the scent of sugar and vanilla wrapping around me, the glow from the street lamps stretching long across the polished floor. Outside, the sea kept moving, restless and relentless, like the heartbeat in my chest. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the tide curled in on itself, whispering secrets I couldn't quite catch. Did that shadowy figure ever return? A year can change everything, and yet leave certain shadows exactly where they've always been. The bakery had grown into more than a business. It was the living, breathing heart of the town. Morning spilled over with the warm scent of cinnamon rolls and freshly brewed coffee drifting out onto the street, curling into the air like an open invitation. By mid-afternoon, the space hummed with quiet chatter, the scrape of wooden chairs and the gentle chime of the door as neighbors came and went. The display case rarely stayed full for long. Each cupcake, each tart was a small piece of my story, layered with the patience, grit, and stubborn hope it had taken to win back my life. The walls seemed to hold every conversation that had ever been spoken here. Fishermen trading stories of rough seas, students laughing over textbooks, old friends leaning close to whisper secrets. Even travelers who wandered in off the coastal road found themselves staying longer than planned, as if the scent of vanilla and sugar could slow the ticking of the clock. Above the door, my parents' names were carved into the smooth grain of the new sign, catching the late afternoon light like burnished gold. Every time I looked at them, I felt that quiet, fierce reminder. I fought for this. It happened on a Tuesday, just another ordinary day, until it wasn't. The mail sat in its usual spot on the counter, tucked between invoices and a glossy recipe magazine. I almost didn't notice the cream-colored envelope in the middle of the stack, plain except for the slanted handwriting across the front. But the second I saw those letters, those looping strokes and deliberate angles, my breath caught. My father's handwriting. It couldn't be. He had been gone for years. Still, the sight of it sent a sharp tremor through me, like a wire pulled too tight. My fingers hesitated, then broke the seal, the paper whispering against itself. Inside was a single sheet, the ink slightly blurred as if it had been scrawled in haste or caught by damp air. One sentence. That was all it said. Sarah wasn't alone. Someone else knows the truth. The words rang in my ears, muting the soft clink of cups and the easy hum of the bakery's playlist. I read them again, slower, searching for hidden meaning between the lines. There was none, just the blunt weight of implication. My mind leapt backward to that winter night, to the dock swallowed in fog, to the shadowy figure who'd stood just far enough away that I couldn't make out their face, the figure who turned and slipped into the darkness before I could take a step closer. I'd told myself it was nothing, a trick of the cold and my own paranoia, but now I slid the letter back into the envelope, careful, almost reluctant, as though sealing it could somehow contain the unease twisting in my chest. I kept moving through the day, serving coffee, boxing pastries, smiling when expected, but it was mechanical. The single line from that letter wove through everything, like a thread pulling the edges of my focus apart. By closing time, the air inside felt too warm, the space too close. I locked the door, the jingle of keys sharp in the stillness, and stepped out into the night. The wind from the water was sharper than usual, catching my hair and tugging at my coat. The sky had deepened into shades of indigo and slate, the horizon bleeding out the last traces of daylight. I walked until the street lamps faded and the steady roar of the ocean grew louder. The sand was cool and slightly damp under my boots as I reached the edge of the tide. I pulled the letter from my pocket. In my hands it felt heavier than paper, as if the salt air had seeped into its fibers, weighing it with secrets I hadn't asked to hold. My father had been gone long before Sarah's betrayal, so how? And if it wasn't him, Who had taken the time to copy his handwriting so perfectly? And why send it to me now, after all this time? The waves rolled in, each crash a low, unyielding answer I couldn't decipher. The wind whipped at my hair and stung my eyes, carrying the sharp scent of salt and seaweed. I could taste the ocean on my lips. I thought about the fight I'd already survived, the cost of digging into the past, and the possibility that this letter, could pull me right back into the undertow. Should I chase it? Pull on that thread and risk unraveling the life I had so carefully stitched back together? Or should I let it go? Let the tide swallow it whole and never look back? Behind me, the town's lights glowed warm and steady, the bakery's sign just visible in the distance. That was my life now, rooted in the smell of fresh bread, the chatter of people who chose to stay, the names above the door that would never fade. But in my pocket, the envelope pressed against my palm, an anchor to a past that refused to stay buried. I took one last look at the dark line of the horizon. Somewhere out there, the truth was still moving, hidden under the endless pull of the tide. I turned toward home, but the question followed me, as relentless as the ocean's breath. Should I dig deeper into the past? Share your stories of family secrets below. Hit like, subscribe, and let's keep uncovering the truth together.